The suburbs of Hillcrest Heights, where every lawn was pristine, every house stood in neat rows, and every family put up a facade of normality, were an unlikely setting for scandal. It was a place where gossip flowed just below the surface, and the lives of its inhabitants were, to the naked eye, perfect. The story that would rock this quiet neighborhood and expose its darkest secrets began in the spring of 2018, when Rebecca Donovan, a seemingly content housewife, found herself ensnared in a dangerous web of passion, deceit, and ultimately murder. Chapter 1. The New Neighbors. Rebecca Donovan's life had settled into a rhythm that was, in many ways, too predictable. At 37, she had been married to her high school sweetheart Tom for 15 years. They had 2 children, Katie, 13, and Ryan, 10, who filled their lives with the usual chaos and busyness of suburban family life. Tom, an investment banker, worked long hours, and while they were comfortable financially, Rebecca often found herself feeling lonely. Their marriage wasn't unhappy, but the fire that had once burned so brightly between them had dimmed over the years. Tom's frequent absences, both physically and emotionally, left Rebecca feeling disconnected. She spent her days running errands, volunteering at the school, and ensuring the house was spotless, a picture-perfect wife and mother. But beneath the surface, something inside her yearned for more. That more arrived in the form of the Harrisons, a family that moved into the house next door. The Harrisons were an attractive couple in their late 40s, with a 17-year-old son, Jason. From the moment they moved in, Rebecca found herself intrigued by them. They were charming and sophisticated, and unlike many of their other neighbors, they exuded a kind of mysterious allure. But it wasn't the parents, Evelyn and Paul Harrison, who caught Rebecca's attention most. It was Jason. Jason was tall, athletic, with unruly dark hair and piercing blue eyes that held a confidence beyond his years. Rebecca first noticed him when she caught him jogging shirtless past her house one morning. She watched from the kitchen window, her heart racing with an inexplicable thrill. She scolded herself for even entertaining such thoughts. He was, after all, still a teenager, nearly 20 years younger than her. Yet something about him stirred a long-dormant part of her. Chapter 2. Forbidden glances. The attraction grew slowly at first. Jason began stopping by their house under the guise of befriending Ryan, who idolized the older boy. He would come over after school, playing basketball with Ryan in the driveway or helping him with his homework. Rebecca often watched them, her eyes lingering on Jason's lean frame as he moved with a fluid grace that seemed effortless. It wasn't long before their interactions became more frequent. At first, it was just casual conversations when Jason came to pick up Ryan, or when she passed him in the yard. But those conversations grew longer, and soon Rebecca found herself seeking out excuses to talk to him. Jason, for his part, seemed equally drawn to her. His glances lingered a little too long, and there was a spark in his eyes whenever they spoke that sent a shiver down Rebecca's spine. The first time they touched, it was accidental. Rebecca had been helping him carry some sports equipment out of the garage, and their hands brushed against each other. The contact was electric, sending a jolt of excitement through her. They both froze for a moment, their eyes locking in silent acknowledgement of the tension between them. After that, things escalated quickly. Chapter 3. The affair. It was a rainy afternoon in late June when Rebecca and Jason's relationship crossed the line. Tom was away on another business trip, and the kids were at their grandparents' house for the weekend. The house felt empty, and Rebecca was restless. She had spent the day cleaning and organizing, trying to keep herself busy, but nothing could shake the gnawing feeling of loneliness. Jason showed up unexpectedly, drenched from the rain. His car had broken down a few blocks away, and he asked to use the phone to call a tow truck. Rebecca let him in, offering him a towel and a cup of coffee while he waited. They sat together in the living room, the sound of the rain beating against the windows creating an intimate cocoon around them. They talked as they always did, but this time there was an undercurrent of something much deeper. Jason's eyes never left hers, and Rebecca could feel the heat building between them. When he leaned in to kiss her, she didn't pull away. Their affair began that afternoon. What started as a moment of weakness quickly spiraled into something much more intense. They would steal moments together whenever they could, sneaking around the neighborhood, meeting in secret and using any opportunity to be alone. Rebecca knew it was wrong. Jason was young, too young, and she was risking everything. But the thrill of it all was intoxicating, and for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Jason, for his part, was equally smitten. He was young, reckless, and infatuated with the idea of being involved with an older woman. Rebecca represented everything he had fantasized about: mature, beautiful, and forbidden. He didn't care about the consequences. All he wanted was her. But as with all secrets, it was only a matter of time before someone found out. Chapter 4: A Dangerous Obsession. As the summer wore on, Rebecca and Jason's affair became harder to hide. The thrill of their secret encounters was overshadowed by the growing paranoia that they might be caught. Rebecca found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if anyone had noticed the way Jason lingered around her house or the stolen glances they exchanged. She could feel the walls closing in around her, but she couldn't bring herself to end the affair. It wasn't just the fear of getting caught that weighed on Rebecca's mind. Jason's behavior had started to change. What had begun as a passionate affair was turning into something darker. Jason was becoming possessive, showing up at her house unannounced and demanding more of her time. He would get angry if she didn't answer his calls or if she seemed distracted. At first, Rebecca dismissed it as youthful jealousy, but it quickly became clear that Jason's feelings for her had grown into an obsession. One evening, as they lay together in the dim light of a hotel room just outside town, Jason turned to her with a look she hadn't seen before, a mix of desperation and determination. "Leave him," he said, his voice firm. "Leave Tom. Be with me." Rebecca froze. She had known that their relationship couldn't go on forever, but she hadn't expected Jason to push for something more. The thought of leaving Tom, of tearing her family apart, was terrifying. She loved Jason, or at least she thought she did, but she couldn't imagine abandoning the life she had built for a relationship that was destined to end in disaster. "I can't," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I have a family, Jason. We can't do this." Jason's face darkened, and for the first time, Rebecca saw a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but the tension between them was palpable. Rebecca felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach, but she pushed it aside, telling herself that it would be fine. Jason would get over it. But he didn't. Chapter 5: The Unraveling. As the weeks went on, Jason's obsession grew more intense. He began following Rebecca, showing up at the grocery store, the kids' school, and even the gym where she worked out. He called her constantly, leaving angry voicemails when she didn't pick up. Rebecca tried to distance herself, but every time she tried to end things, Jason would plead with her, telling her that he couldn't live without her. Rebecca was trapped. She couldn't go to Tom, couldn't explain the situation without revealing the affair, and she couldn't go to the police without risking everything. She felt like she was suffocating, her world closing in around her. One night, after a particularly heated argument with Jason, Rebecca made a decision. She couldn't do this anymore. The affair had to end. She would talk to Jason one last time, tell him that it was over, and then she would try to repair the damage she had done to her marriage. But Jason had other plans. Chapter 6: The Confrontation. It was a quiet evening in mid-September when everything came to a head. Rebecca was home alone, Tom was at a business dinner, and the kids were at a friend's house for a sleepover. She had been on edge all day, her mind racing with thoughts of how she would break things off with Jason. She knew he would be angry, but she hoped that he would understand, that he would finally let her go. The knock on the door came just after sunset. Rebecca's heart leapt into her throat as she opened the door to find Jason standing there, his eyes wild and his hands shaking. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past her into the house. Rebecca closed the door and followed him into the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. Jason was agitated, pacing back and forth, his fists clenched at his sides. "I can't do this anymore, Jason," she said, her voice trembling. "It's over." Jason stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression one of disbelief. "What do you mean it's over?" he demanded. "You can't just end this, Rebecca. We're meant to be together." Rebecca took a step back, fear creeping into her voice. "Jason, please," she said softly. "This isn't healthy. I have a family, a life. We can't keep doing this." Jason's face twisted in anger, and before Rebecca could react, he lunged at her. The force of his attack knocked her to the ground, and for a moment, Rebecca was too stunned to move. Chapter 7. Descent into Chaos. Rebecca gasped as the weight of Jason's body crushed her to the floor, her mind scrambling to process the sudden escalation of violence. She had always known Jason was intense, but this was something different. This was raw, unbridled rage. She struggled beneath him, trying to push him off, but he was stronger, his hands gripping her arms with bruising force. "Jason, stop!" she cried, panic overtaking her as his eyes burned with a wildness she had never seen before. "Please!" But Jason wasn't listening. His breathing was ragged, his face inches from hers. The tension that had simmered between them for months had finally exploded, and there was no turning back. He pinned her down, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can just end this? Like it was nothing?" His grip tightened, his fingers digging into her skin. "You think I'll let you go back to him, after everything we've shared?" Rebecca's heart raced, terror creeping into her veins. This wasn't the boy she had fallen into a dangerous affair with. This was someone else, someone dangerous. She kicked out, desperate to free herself, her foot connecting with his shin. It was enough to unbalance him, and she managed to wriggle out from beneath him, scrambling to her feet. "Get out!" she shouted, backing away toward the kitchen. "Get out of my house, Jason!" But Jason wasn't backing down. He followed her, his movements quick and predatory. His eyes were blazing, and for the first time Rebecca realized how unhinged he had become. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he snarled, advancing toward her. "I've given you everything. I've been there for you when no one else was. You belong to me, Rebecca." Rebecca's back hit the kitchen counter, and she fumbled for something, anything, that could help her defend herself. Her hand landed on a kitchen knife, and without thinking, she gripped it, holding it out in front of her. "Stay back," she warned, her voice shaking. "I don't want to hurt you, Jason. Just leave." Jason's eyes flicked to the knife in her hand, and for a moment it seemed as though he might listen. But then he lunged again, and Rebecca acted on pure instinct. She slashed out with the knife, the blade cutting across his arm. Jason screamed, clutching his bleeding arm, his face twisted in shock and pain. Rebecca stood frozen, the knife still in her hand, her chest heaving as the reality of what she had just done sank in. She had hurt him, really hurt him. But Jason's anger only seemed to intensify. He looked at her with a fury that sent chills down her spine. "You're going to regret that," he growled, advancing on her once more. In a blind panic, Rebecca swung the knife again, and this time the blade sank deep into Jason's chest. For a moment, everything went still. Jason's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. He staggered backward, his hands grasping at the knife that was now protruding from his chest. Blood blossomed across his shirt, dark and viscous, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Rebecca stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her ears. Time seemed to slow down as she stared at Jason's body on the floor, the life slowly draining from his eyes. She had killed him. Oh God, she had killed him. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. For what felt like hours, Rebecca stood motionless, her mind numb with shock. The knife was still in her hand, slick with Jason's blood. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her entire body trembled as the weight of what she had done crashed down on her. She had killed him. She had killed Jason. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer, and she dropped the knife, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She backed away from Jason's lifeless body, her mind racing. What was she going to do? How could she possibly explain this? No one would believe her. They would think she was some sort of monster, a murderer. Rebecca's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could help her. She couldn't just leave Jason's body here. She had to get rid of it. But how? The panic clawed at her, threatening to swallow her whole. Just as her thoughts spiraled out of control, the sound of the front door opening jolted her back to reality. "Rebecca!" Tom's voice called from the entryway. "I'm home. Where are you?" Rebecca's blood ran cold. Tom wasn't supposed to be home yet. He was supposed to be at his business dinner until late. How was she going to explain this? How could she possibly explain why their neighbor's son was lying dead on the kitchen floor? Her heart pounded in her chest as Tom's footsteps grew closer. She had no time to think, no time to clean up the mess she had made. Tom was going to see everything: the blood, the body, the knife. And when he did, he would know. He would know everything. Tom appeared in the doorway, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. His eyes landed on the scene before him. Rebecca standing in the middle of the kitchen, her clothes stained with blood, and Jason lying on the floor, his body motionless. "Jesus Christ," Tom breathed, his face paling as he took in the sight. Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, to try to explain, but no words came out. She could only stand there, her hands trembling as Tom slowly approached her, his eyes wide with shock. "What the hell happened?" he demanded, his voice thick with disbelief. "Rebecca, what the hell did you do?" Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes, and she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Tom stared at her, his face a mask of confusion and horror. He looked from her to Jason's body, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. "Wasn't supposed to happen like what?" he asked, his voice rising in panic. "Rebecca, what the hell is going on?" Rebecca swallowed hard, trying to find the words. She had no choice now. She had to tell him the truth. "It was an accident," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to kill him, I swear." Tom's eyes widened in shock, and he took a step back, his face paling even further. You killed him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He came here," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "He wouldn't leave me alone. He attacked me, and I had to defend myself." Tom stood there for a moment, his mind racing, trying to process what his wife had just told him. The truth was too much to bear. His world had just been shattered in an instant. But even as the weight of Rebecca's confession sank in, Tom knew they were in deep trouble. The body of their neighbor's son lay dead in their home, and Rebecca was the one responsible. No one would believe it was self-defense, not after everything. "We need to call the police," Tom said, his voice steady but filled with dread. Rebecca's heart stopped. The police? She couldn't call the police. If they found out about the affair, if they found out the truth, her life would be over. "No," she said, her voice frantic. "We can't. Tom, please, we can't let anyone find out." Tom stared at her, disbelief etched into his features. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "We have to tell someone. We can't just hide this." But Rebecca was already shaking her head, her mind spinning with fear. "They'll find out," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll know about Jason and me. They'll know everything." Tom's eyes widened in realization, and for the first time, he understood the full scope of what had happened. His wife had been having an affair with their neighbor's son, and now that affair had ended in murder. A heavy silence fell over the room, the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. Tom closed his eyes, his mind racing with the impossibility of what to do next. He was furious, heartbroken, and terrified all at once. But there was no going back. They were in too deep now. "We'll figure this out," Tom said finally, his voice grim. "But we need to move fast." Rebecca nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was only the beginning of their nightmare. Chapter 9. The Cover-Up. In the hours that followed, Rebecca and Tom worked in silence, their hands trembling as they tried to clean up the mess. They wrapped Jason's body in a tarp, scrubbing the blood from the kitchen floor and disposing of the knife. Every move felt surreal, as if they were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Tom was distant, his emotions locked away as he focused on the task at hand. Rebecca could feel the walls between them growing higher with every passing moment. Their marriage, once imperfect but stable, was now irrevocably shattered. The weight of the affair, the murder, and the lies that followed would hang over them forever. By the time the sun rose the next morning, they had buried Jason's body deep in the woods outside of town. It was a place they knew well, a spot Tom had taken the kids camping a few times. The irony of using such a peaceful, familial place to cover up a murder wasn't lost on either of them, but it was secluded and rarely visited, a perfect place to hide a terrible secret. The drive back home was suffocating. The silence between Rebecca and Tom was unbearable, thick with unspoken accusations and guilt. Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, while Rebecca stared out the window, her mind a swirl of guilt, terror, and regret. When they returned home, it was as if nothing had happened. The house was clean, the kids would be back in a few hours, and the world outside went on, blissfully unaware of the horrific events that had transpired. But inside, everything had changed. Rebecca's stomach churned with nausea, and Tom's cold distance was like a wall she couldn't penetrate. She knew that whatever they had shared as husband and wife was now over. The plan was simple. They would act like everything was normal. They would wait for Jason's disappearance to be noticed, and when it was, they would feign ignorance. No one would suspect them, and if they could maintain the lie, they would get away with it. But deep down, Rebecca knew that no matter how well they hid the truth, they would never be free from it. Chapter 10. The Disappearance. It didn't take long for Jason's parents, Evelyn and Paul Harrison, to realize that their son was missing. When Jason failed to return home the night after his argument with Rebecca, his parents began calling his phone, but there was no answer. At first, they assumed he was out with friends. He was, after all, a teenager prone to impulsive decisions. But as the hours passed with no sign of him, their worry grew. The following day, when Jason still hadn't come home, the Harrisons contacted the police. Within hours, a search was organized. Flyers were printed, friends and neighbors were interviewed, and the entire community was put on high alert. Hillcrest Heights, with its quiet streets and seemingly perfect families, had suddenly become the site of a tragic mystery. Rebecca watched the search unfold with growing dread. Every time she saw Evelyn and Paul, their faces drawn with worry and exhaustion, a fresh wave of guilt crashed over her. She avoided them as much as possible, making excuses to stay inside or sending Tom out to speak with them. She couldn't face them, knowing what she had done. As the days passed and no trace of Jason was found, the town began to buzz with speculation. Whispers of foul play spread through the community, but no one could imagine who might have harmed him. Jason was a popular kid, well liked by everyone. The idea that he had been murdered was too terrible for most to consider, but not for Rebecca. She lived with that truth every day. Chapter 11. Cracks in the facade. For weeks, Rebecca and Tom maintained their facade of normalcy. They went to work, attended school events, and participated in neighborhood gatherings as though nothing had changed. But behind closed doors, their marriage was crumbling. Tom barely spoke to her, and when he did, it was curt and filled with resentment. He hadn't forgiven her for the affair, and every time he looked at her, she could see the disgust in his eyes. Rebecca, on the other hand, was falling apart. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, her thoughts consumed by the image of Jason's body lying lifeless in the kitchen. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, heard his voice begging her to leave Tom. She had never intended for things to go so far, and now the weight of her actions was suffocating her. One night, as they sat in their darkened living room, Tom finally broke the silence. "We can't keep living like this," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Rebecca looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known this conversation was coming, but she wasn't prepared for it. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We're barely speaking. I can't look at you without thinking about what you did, about what we did. It's not a marriage anymore." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. She had known that their relationship was fractured beyond repair, but hearing Tom say it out loud made it real. "I didn't want this," she said, her voice trembling. "I never wanted any of this to happen." Tom's expression hardened. "But it did, and now we're stuck living with it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their shared guilt hung between them, a silent reminder of the blood on their hands. Finally, Tom stood up, his face expressionless. "I'm going to stay with my brother for a while," he said, heading toward the door. "Maybe some space will help us figure out what to do next." Rebecca didn't try to stop him. She watched him leave, her heart breaking as the door clicked shut behind him. She was alone now, trapped in a prison of her own making. Chapter 12. A Dark Revelation. Tom's absence left Rebecca with too much time to think. The house was empty and quiet, giving her no distractions from the storm of emotions raging inside her. She found herself replaying the events of that fateful night over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of how everything had gone so horribly wrong. As the days passed, Rebecca became more and more paranoid. Every time the phone rang or there was a knock at the door, her heart would leap into her throat, convinced that someone had discovered the truth. The police had questioned her and Tom about Jason's disappearance, but they had stuck to their story. No one suspected them, yet. But one afternoon, as Rebecca was going through the mail, she found an envelope addressed to her with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and her blood ran cold when she saw the contents inside. The envelope was a single photograph of Jason. It was a photo she had never seen before. Jason standing in her kitchen, taken from outside the window. The timestamp in the corner indicated it had been taken just minutes before their final confrontation. Someone had been watching. Rebecca's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could have taken the photo? Was it someone who had suspected their affair all along? Or was it someone who had followed Jason, seen what had happened, and now knew the dark truth she and Tom had been hiding? The note at the bottom of the photo sent a chill down her spine. "I know what you did." Chapter 13. The blackmail. Rebecca's hands shook as she clutched the photo, her mind spinning. Someone knew, but who? Was it a neighbor? A passerby? She quickly searched her memory, trying to recall anyone who might have been around that night. But nothing came to mind. No one had been nearby. Or so she had thought. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the old park tonight. Come alone. If you tell anyone, I'll go to the police." Rebecca's blood ran cold. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching, they wanted something. The thought of going to the meeting terrified her, but she knew she had no choice. If this person had more evidence, more photos, or worse, proof of what she had done, her life was over. She didn't tell Tom. She didn't tell anyone. She simply put the photo away, slipped on her coat, and left the house as dusk fell, her heart pounding with dread. The old park was quiet and deserted when Rebecca arrived. It was the kind of place that kids used to play in years ago, but had since been abandoned, overgrown with weeds, and forgotten by the town. Rebecca walked through the rusty gates, her breath visible in the cool night air, her senses on high alert. "Over here!" The voice came from the shadows, startling her. She turned to see a figure standing by the old swing set. As she approached, her heart sank. It was Evelyn Harrison, Jason's mother. Chapter 14. A Mother's Revenge. Evelyn stepped into the dim light of a street lamp, her face tight with anger, her eyes red from what Rebecca assumed were weeks of sleepless nights and grief. But there was something else there too, something cold and calculating. "You look surprised," Evelyn said, her voice low. "You didn't think I'd figure it out, did you?" Rebecca's mouth went dry. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Evelyn's eyes were locked onto hers, filled with a fury that sent a shiver down Rebecca's spine. "I know about the affair," Evelyn continued, her voice bitter. "I've known for months. I saw the way Jason looked at you, the way you looked at him. I warned him to stay away from you, but he wouldn't listen." Rebecca took a step back, her heart racing. "Evelyn, Don't!" Evelyn snapped, cutting her off. "Don't try to deny it. I know what you did, Rebecca. I know that you killed him." Rebecca's stomach twisted, her heart pounding in her chest. "It was an accident," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "He attacked me, and I didn't mean to kill him. I swear." Evelyn's face hardened, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "I don't care if it was an accident. My son is dead because of you." Rebecca took another step back, her pulse racing. "What do you want from me?" Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes cold. "I want you to suffer like I've suffered. I want you to live with the same fear and guilt that I've been living with since the day my son disappeared. And if you don't do exactly what I say, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." Rebecca's breath hitched. "What do you want me to do?" Evelyn's smile widened, a cruel gleam in her eyes. "I haven't decided yet. But when the time comes, you'll know. And if you ever try to cross me, I'll destroy everything you have left." Rebecca nodded, too terrified to argue. She had no choice now. Evelyn had her trapped, just as surely as she had trapped Jason that night in her kitchen. As Rebecca walked away from the park, her heart heavy with dread, she knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. Chapter 15. Living in Fear. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca lived in constant fear. Every time her phone buzzed or the doorbell rang, her stomach twisted in knots, terrified that Evelyn would follow through on her threats. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the gnawing fear that her life would come crashing down around her. Tom returned from his brother's house, but things between them were even colder than before. He didn't ask where she had gone or what she had been doing while he was away, and she didn't volunteer any information. The silence between them was unbearable, but it was safer that way. Safer for him not to know what Evelyn was planning. But the waiting was the worst part. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, with no word from Evelyn. The uncertainty gnawed at Rebecca's nerves, leaving her on edge, constantly looking over her shoulder. She had no idea when Evelyn would make her move, but she knew it was only a matter of time. And then, one night, it happened. Chapter 16. The Final Confrontation. It was late when Rebecca's phone buzzed. She picked it up, her heart racing as she saw a text from Evelyn. "Come to the house." Now Rebecca's hands shook as she read the message. She knew what Evelyn wanted, and she knew that whatever it was, it wouldn't end well. But she had no choice. She couldn't ignore the summons. When she arrived at the Harrison house, the lights were off, the front door slightly ajar. Rebecca stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was eerily silent, the only sound her own breathing as she moved through the darkened rooms. "Evelyn?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Rebecca's pulse quickened as she moved deeper into the house, her nerves on edge. The living room was empty, as was the kitchen. Panic began to rise in her chest as she realized that something was very, very wrong. And then she saw it. A figure lay on the floor, motionless. Rebecca's heart stopped as she rushed forward, her breath catching in her throat. It was Evelyn. Blood pooled around her body, a knife sticking out of her chest. Rebecca's mind reeled as she took in the scene, her heart pounding in her chest. What had happened? Who had done this? Before she could make sense of the situation, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind her. She turned, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Paul Harrison standing in the doorway, his face twisted with grief and rage. "You
he whispered, his voice filled with venom. "You did this." Rebecca's eyes widened in horror. "No, I didn't." But Paul wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, his face contorted with fury as he lunged at her, his hands wrapping around her throat. Rebecca struggled, gasping for breath as Paul's grip tightened, her vision blurring as darkness closed in around her. And then everything went black. Epilogue: Rebecca never woke up. The police arrived at the Harrison house later that night, responding to a neighbor's call about a disturbance. They found Paul sitting in the living room, his wife and Rebecca both dead at his feet. The town of Hillcrest Heights was rocked by the tragedy. In the end, the truth about Jason's affair with Rebecca never came to light. All anyone knew was that 2 more lives had been lost, and the Harrisons' grief had spiraled into madness. The secrets Rebecca had kept, the lies she had told, were buried with her. But the scars left behind would linger, haunting those who remained. Hillcrest Heights would never be the same again.